The pharaoh Akhenaten moved his court from Thebes to a flat plain beside the Nile, where new temples rose without roofs, and the midday sun fell directly on wide altars of colored stone. He declared that the old pantheon of Egypt would fade, and that a single disk of light, the Aten, held the kingdom's prayers alone in the dry air. Priests in the old cities found their estates growing quiet, their incense smoke thinning in chapels where goats later slept in the shade. After his death, workmen returned to the abandoned city and gently buried the stone columns in sand, hiding the scandal of a god who had been reduced to one. In the winter of 1527, clerks copied Latin phrases by lamplight in rooms that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, recording in neat handwriting whether a marriage of 18 years had been lawful from its first night. Cardinals sent velvet pouches of documents across the channel, and the Queen waited in rooms hung with Flemish tapestries, her embroidery frame catching the light from narrow, arched windows. The scandal did not arrive with shouting, but with the steady accumulation of parchment, each page adding weight to a king's wish for a different wife. For 7 years, the papers traveled back and forth, growing soft at the edges from much handling. Queen Christina of Sweden wore men's clothing at court and preferred the company of philosophers to the duties of state, sleeping little and reading by candlelight until the library walls seemed to breathe with paper dust and vellum. In 1654, she signed her abdication in a room of silver cloth, handing the crown to her cousin with steady hands while the castle trumpets sounded outside in the sharp, cold spring air. She left by carriage for Rome, traveling under the name of a count, her scandal not one of blood but of refusal. The palace corridors settled into a quieter rhythm without her quick, light footsteps. A cardinal wished to please the Queen of France, and a countess forged letters in handwriting so careful that the jeweler believed he was selling a 2 million liver necklace to the palace itself in 1785. When the deception broke, the scandal did not rest on the Queen, who had never touched the diamonds, but on the quiet audacity of the fraud and the public's desire to imagine her guilt. The trial lasted for months in rooms where winter light faded by 4 in the afternoon, and witnesses spoke in low voices about doors opened at midnight and carriages waiting in the yellow fog. The necklace was eventually broken apart and sold in London, its stones scattered like ordinary rain. George, Prince of Wales, married his cousin Caroline in 1795 after agreeing to settle his enormous debts, and the couple separated within weeks, preferring different wings of the palace and eventually entirely different countries. She lived in Italy and entertained guests, with dances on terraces above the Mediterranean while he collected porcelain and waited to become king. When he ascended the throne in 1820, his government tried to dissolve the marriage by accusation, and London filled with pamphlets, but the bill was quietly abandoned after crowds showed sympathy for the Queen. She was not crowned, and she died the following year, leaving the king to order the curtains of his seaside rooms drawn for mourning he did not truly feel. In December of 1936, a king signed his name to a document that ended a reign of less than 11 months, choosing marriage to an American divorcee over the stone weight of a crown he had never particularly wanted to wear in the first place. The act took place in a private house, not a palace, with only a few ministers standing by the fireplace while rain soaked the rhododendrons outside. Broadcasting equipment was carried up to the study so he could explain his decision to the Empire in a voice that sounded tired and remarkably calm. By evening, the papers had changed his title, and the house grew quiet except for the ticking of a mantel clock and the settling of coals. The letters and judgments of royal scandal now rest in temperature-controlled rooms. Tied with ribbon that has gone the color of weak tea, the handwriting faded to a soft, warm brown. Scholars read them under lamps that do not flicker, and the urgency that once shook kingdoms has settled into the rustle of turning pages and the measured click of a camera shutter. Each story remains complete in its folder, separated from the noise it caused by long centuries of stillness and the slow chemical calm of aging paper. The paper survives longer than the thrones, and the ink longer than the voices that dictated it. A courtier once carried this letter through torchlit corridors where stone drank the sound of his footsteps. The words arranged a second marriage that would sever a kingdom from Rome and send a queen to the scaffold. Now the parchment curls only slightly at its edges, and the urgency has become a texture that scholars touch through cotton gloves. The seal is cracked across the center, and the imprinted profile no longer matches any living face. The stitches remain precisely uneven, the pattern of a hunted deer among thorns left incomplete in the third week of May. Someone set down the wooden hoop and did not return to tighten the frame. The thread has faded to the color of old brick, and the cloth holds the shape of hands that trembled only slightly, while a small spaniel woven in cream and black sits unfinished at the margin, one eye missing, the other staring toward the door. Attendants once carried this painting to a palace storage room and leaned it against the rafters for 3 decades. The varnish cracked in a pattern resembling dry riverbeds, and when the canvas was brought down again, restorers found a layer of grime so fine it had formed a second skin across the bodice. They cleaned the skirt, but left the face untouched, deciding that the damage told more than the original brushwork. A queen walked here each morning at 6, wearing the same gray dress until the hem darkened permanently with dew, pausing to crush a mint leaf between her fingers as servants watched from a distance. The scandal was her silence, and the silence outlasted the rain. The bench faces a wall rather than a view, placed there by a gardener who understood the need to look at something that asked nothing back. Cardinals and queens denied ever touching these stones, yet the settings retain the oils of several palms. A jeweler's invoice, folded small as a cough drop, records interest payments that continued for 17 years. The debt outlived the monarchy, and the paste diamonds grew cloudy in the dark, though a curator once found a single horsehair caught in the central setting, thin and blonde, preserved by the metal's slow tarnish. A voice emerged from this box one evening in December, steady and clipped, renouncing a throne for a house in the country and a woman who preferred navy blue suits. The household staff stood in the corridor with their hands clasped, and when the broadcast ended, the room filled with the ticking of a long-case clock. Someone closed the door and did not reopen it for a week, leaving the ashtray undisturbed and the pipe cleaner slowly browning in the dry air. An empress packed and unpacked this trunk more than 40 times, fleeing courts where protocol required her to remain seated for 6 hours. The silver bristles retain a few long hairs the color of unlit candles, and attendants stopped announcing her arrivals because the dates no longer matched the calendars. The violet oil has turned thick and dark as molasses, but the lid still releases a faint sweetness when lifted, like the memory of a corridor walked at midnight. A queen arrived at this door in a hired carriage after midnight, wearing a silver gown and a diadem of artificial gemstones that caught the torchlight in brief flashes as she stepped onto the worn threshold. Guards linked arms across the opening and informed her that the service within was full, though the echo of an unoccupied gallery could be heard behind them. She remained in the vestibule for 3 hours, listening to the muffled drums, and when she left, the lavender on the carpet had been crushed into the fibers by her steady pacing. Each scandal left an object behind: a letter, a stitch, a strand of hair, a stone worn smooth by pacing. They rest now in rooms where temperature never varies by more than 2 degrees, and the shame has dried out. What remains is the weight of paper, the faint scent of cedar, and the knowledge that every door once slammed is now held shut only by gravity and a latch of quiet brass. The letter was written with a quill that had split halfway through the third sentence, leaving the last vowels thicker and slower than the first. A reader in 1795 traced the same lines until the paper grew soft at its folded corners. It has not been unfolded since a previous century, and the creases hold a permanent shadow. A prince once stood at this table and signed a renunciation he did not read past the second line. The chair behind him remains drawn back at the angle of a sudden departure. Dust has settled evenly across the leather seat, giving it the texture of pale suede. The turned canvas shows only its stretched linen back, tightened by 2 centuries of sitting in darkness. Conservators leave it untouched, and the oil paint on its hidden side has dried to a surface as hard as shell. A small brass plate beneath it gives only a date and a first initial. The hair was cut by candlelight during an evening when rain struck the east windows without stopping. The ribbon has retained the shape of the curl it once secured, though the velvet beneath it has flattened to the color of dried sage. No one has opened the latch for 80 years, and the hinge holds a film of soft tarnish. Footpaths here were raked smooth each dawn by a gardener who has been dead for 130 years. The variety that once bloomed in this corner was bred specifically for a wedding that was later cancelled by announcement in the Gazette. Only the rootstock remains, sending up suckers of plain white dog rose that no one tends. The marriage performed here lacked the required witnesses, so the registry records the names in a column usually reserved for baptisms. The priest's alb was folded and stored in a chest that now smells of camphor and old wool. Light comes through a narrow window in the afternoon, making a pale rectangle on the stone floor that does not reach the altar. A woman in court dress paused on the 7th step to remove a glove she would later leave behind in an antechamber. The treads where her heels rested have been polished by later footsteps until the marble there is a shade lighter than the rest. A draftsman measured the wear in 1842 and sketched the profile in a notebook that rests now in a municipal archive. Letters were burned beside this water in a brazier that left a ring of scorch on the gravel still visible when the ground is wet. The ashes washed into the lake during a week of rain in 1820, and the current carried them toward the eastern shallows where silt has long since buried them. A heron often stands in that spot, motionless for hours. One cover is shorter than the rest, and beneath it hangs a bodice of silver tissue that has darkened to the color of birch bark. The seams were let out once, then taken in again, and the thread used for the final adjustment does not match the original spool. A sachet of orris root tied to the hanger has lost its scent to the wool of neighboring garments. The cards were delivered by hand to a house on a square where the door knocker was later removed to discourage visitors. The topmost card still carries a faint imprint of a thumb pressed into the paper, while the ink was barely dry. The calendar on which they once rested has been preserved, its pages turned only up to the 14th of the month. A volume pulled from this shelf in 1778 recorded payments to a silversmith for a locket that was never claimed. The pages near the back list sums for coach hire at night and candles bought in bulk, the handwriting growing tighter as the lines descend. The book has been rebound twice, and the current spine is the color of dried wheat. The chairs were set out for a conversation that lasted until the garden lamps burned low, and afterward one chair was moved 2 inches closer while the other remained in place. Moss now fills the iron scrollwork of the nearer chair, softening its edges to the texture of brushed wool. The table holds no trace of the cups that once stood there, only the rust blooming in a pattern shaped like a watermark. The box once contained a miniature painted on ivory, so thin the backing showed the grain of the tusks. The ivory has been removed to a climate-controlled case in another wing, and the empty box rattles faintly when a drawer is pulled too quickly. The broken clasp rests in the corner of the velvet lining, its gold leaf worn to silver at the pressure point. The box sits in its drawer with the patience of an object that has fulfilled its purpose. A conservator labeled the front with a strip of acid-free paper bearing a number in graphite. The number corresponds to a ledger entry describing the ivory that once fit inside. The drawer slides shut with a soft wooden sigh. The letter mentions a meeting that never appeared in the official diary. The paper fibers have softened over 2 centuries until the sheet bends like cloth under its own weight. A curator once brushed the seal dust into the dish using a badger hair tool no wider than a grass stem. The dish sits in the same position still. Portraits were often turned away when favor ended. The velvet shows a pale rectangle where the picture once blocked light. No one has rotated the frame in many decades. The mahogany has darkened to a shade near black, where the oil from handling hands once stained the edges. Hidden paths were planted for walks that court observers could not trace. The yew grew thicker than planned, swallowing the sound of footsteps. A single stone bench sits at the corridor's end, its seat hollowed by weather into a shallow basin that holds rainwater for days after the sky clears. A single slate tile rests against one leg where a gardener left it years ago. Rooms were closed after certain visitors ceased to arrive. The air inside smells of old sizing and the particular mineral scent of dust from velvet upholstery. The floorboards have shrunk slightly, creating hairline gaps that whisper when the heating system cycles on in winter. A keyhole has been filled with putty, the color of dried porridge. Gifts returned in anger sometimes arrived wrist-strung or missing a single pearl. The missing gem left a gap that collectors now measure with calipers. The satin beneath the coil bears a circular impression where the weight of the necklace pressed for 100 years. The drawer itself smells of cedar and the faint salt of skin oil. Servants moved through these stairs carrying trays and rumors in equal measure. The stone has been polished by leather soles until the treads resemble shallow dishes. At the landing, a window of thick glass distorts the garden below into soft blocks of color. An iron handrail ends in a scroll that fits the palm exactly. Official histories were bound, while contradictory accounts circulated in cheaper pamphlets. The uncut pages suggest this volume was rarely consulted, even when new. The leather has darkened to the color of dried blood, where hands once pulled it from the shelf. Dust has settled into the valleys of the impressed border pattern. Private courts held fountains that masked conversation with the sound of falling water. The basin dried when the pumps failed, and no one ordered repairs. The stone remembers the water line as a band slightly cleaner than the rest. A single leaf from a nearby lime tree rests on the bottom, curled to the shape of a boat. Timepieces in private apartments sometimes stopped during the confusion of sudden departures. The mainspring holds no tension now. The mechanism is silent, and the dome gathers a thin film of airborne wax from the corridor candles burned during evening openings. The mahogany case has checked with age into a grid of fine lines. Chambers were prepared for occupants who never returned to occupy them. The feathers inside the pillows have settled into dense cakes that no longer rebound when pressed. Housekeepers still smooth the coverlet each quarter as part of a routine established long ago. The room faces north and receives no direct sun at any season. Foot traffic altered the color of the oak over generations. The lighter paths mark where certain visitors paced while waiting for doors to open. The current rugs cover different territory, leaving the old bleached lanes exposed to the quiet passage of docents in soft shoes. The air smells of beeswax and the particular dryness of old varnish. Memorial brasses were removed when reputation shifted. The stone remains, bearing the ghost shape of a nameplate. Chapel chairs with needlepoint seats are arranged around it for visitors who sit to rest without reading the empty floor. The kneeler beside one chair has compressed its velvet to a shine. The archives close when the natural light drops below a level that keeps the documents safe. The guards check locks with heavy brass keys that turn with a slow, granular sound. The building settles into the evening temperature, and the objects rest in the dark without commentary. Outside, the yew hedges absorb